Well, hello and welcome back to Faith, Philosophy and Life with me, Mr. Shelton. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope that you're finding these video clips and thoughts really helpful for you. If you were to think about a perfect place that you were to be, behind me is my ideal place. This is the Maldives. This is a lovely, lovely area in the Indian Ocean, which I've never ever been to, but I imagine it's tranquil. And behind me is an island, in which you will understand a little bit more as we go through today's argument. So today we're going to be looking at the Ontological Argument, which was designed by Anselm, and it was put together with some criticisms by a bloke called Guinilo, and he talked about a lost island, hence the image behind me. Let's though begin with a quick Okay, so today we're going to start by looking at Anselm's ontological argument. We're going to see whether it proves the existence of God. And as with everything else that we've looked at so far, it's about the proof rather than the argument. So you need to know the argument to know the proof, which is what we discovered when we looked at the design argument by William Paley and also the cosmological argument by Aquinas. So it's going to be good if we can retell what the ontological argument is, great if you can talk about the logic behind it, and even better if we can evaluate the ontological argument for a number of different perspectives. If you are someone who's making notes, can you make sure you get that title written down, because that's really important that you know what we are learning about. During today's lesson, we're going to look at some paintings, we're going to look at some holidays again, we're going to look at the proslogion, a couple of media clips, and the Lost Island, some responses in a book called Responsio. So let's just start with this. This is a picture. If you were to look around my house, you'd see this picture. This is a picture by a artist which I really like called Pengelly. He's a Christian artist, and in this you've got his idea about what God is like. You've got it as the lion, and anyone that knows their Old Testament knowledge or their knowledge from the Tanakh, God is often described as the Lion of Judah. He's there with a little young boy, and you can see there the idea of peace coming through in this painting. And then further up there, you've got the idea of somebody helping someone through hard times, maybe going to heaven. But I thought, well, what would it be like if I actually drew God myself? Now, I know that for Jews and for Muslims that they wouldn't do this because it would go against the commandments. But I was thinking, what is it that I believe God is like? So this is what I came up with. Yeah, I can hear you all laughing at once. It's to do with the idea of God there with a halo shining out of holiness around his head, spilling out around his body, and then spilling over to my family. My kids, however, saw this picture and they thought they could go one better. They said, "Daddy, that's a really rubbish picture." Now, I think that's a little bit mean personally, but that was their viewpoint. So my boy then drew this picture. He said, "Well, you know, we know what God looks like." I said, "You do?" And he said, "Yes, because God looks like Jesus." And actually, in a way, it's true, because in the Bible, it does say quite clearly that when those that look at Jesus see the face of God. So this is Zacchaeus. This is Jesus looking for Zacchaeus in the tree. And then my daughter drew this one, particularly like this one. This is a picture of Jesus walking on the water. It shows he has power over nature. And that is, in fact, a desert island behind, which fits very well rather than a surfboard. So that's a desert island, and Jesus is walking on the water. What's God actually like? So to start off with then, before we think about the holidays, can I just remind you of omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent? All of those are terms that link to what people think God is like. And we need to think about how and why people might believe that God is those things. And that's something for you to think about and for you to do a little bit of more work around. I'm sure that's something you're all familiar with already. But that made me think about that and think, well, what about holidays? Okay, where would your perfect holiday be? So these, when I was thinking about my perfect holiday, the one at the top left is Conway Castle. I can see a castle theme here I hadn't actually realised before. Conway Castle is a place in Wales. It's a UNESCO heritage site, and the whole city, whole town, sorry, is absolutely beautiful in my opinion. And it's somewhere I like to go each year with my family to have a nose around and just to have a really nice, relaxing break. It'd be really nice though if it didn't rain sometimes. So my perfect holiday would include it not raining. And then behind me is Magic Kingdom. Now obviously it's a very famous castle there, Cinderella's castle, and what you've got in the Magic Kingdom, you've got all these beautiful attractions that again is just amazing, but it is somewhat busy most of the year, I've been told. So I had a great holiday when I went there with my kids. However, it would be even better if it was quiet quite a lot of times. So that would make that holiday a little bit better in the same way the weather would make the Conway Castle a little bit better most of the time. So let's think then about what we've thought about already. Okay, when you think about events that you look forward to, what event is it that you most look forward to? And once you've thought of that, how could it be improved? Okay, so just think for a moment, what would your ideal holiday be and how could it be improved? Well, what event could you look forward to and how could it be improved? Have a think now. Okay, so what Anselm talks about here is he talks very much about the idea of God, and he would say that the concept of God cannot be improved, because if the concept of God could be improved, then the original thing you thought wasn't God. And that's really what we're thinking about today. So there are some key terms on the screen now. I'm going to leave that there for a moment for you. And if you need to make a note of any of those because you don't know that, pause that clip and do that now. Okay, so hopefully you've got those down. So the argument we're looking at today is an a priori argument, and it is a deductive argument as well, because he starts by saying that there is a God and he's going to endeavour to prove that. So I want to just for a moment have a look at how he begins his argument, because this kind of underpins everything that he's talking about. So his argument starts with this. It comes from a quote from the Bible, and it says this: "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." That's fairly clear on Anselm's blick, Anselm's faith perspective. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So consequently, he's going to argue that there is a God, because anyone who believes that there isn't a God is clearly a fool. Now, whatever you might think of that, that's entirely up to you, but that is his premise and that is his point. So the ontological argument is forged around the belief that there is in fact a God. I mentioned this to you previously. Okay, this is from a book written by John Hick. Anselm's main work was not written obviously with John Hick, it was written in the Proslogion, so that's the book there for those of you who need to comment. I'm just going to zoom across the other side of the screen. Okay, so now it means that we can see what's there. So these are some extracts from John Hick. Those of you that have that book or have the online secure platform of mine, I'll pop those across to you as well. But it's on page 15 and 16 of this book anyway. And he talks about a being which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, so I'm just going to read this first premise to you. And it says this: "If then that which a greater cannot be thought exists in the mind alone, this saying that than which greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought, but this is obviously impossible. Therefore there is absolutely no doubt in something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and reality." So his point is, if you imagine there's something that exists, then actually that existing would make it even better. So you can't just imagine in a fluffy cloud that's pink, because as great as that is, if you like pink fluffy clouds, Unless it exists, it's not great. It's only an imagination. So he says for God, you can't just exist in my mind alone, because if you do, then clearly you're not God, because that wouldn't make you great. What makes you great is that you exist in my mind, but actually exist in reality as well. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to make a note about what's good and what's bad about that definition. Again, pause this clip now if you need to. Okay, so his second point, I'll read this premise to you. For something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist. Hence, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not the same as that than which a greater cannot be thought, which is absurd. Something than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly then that it cannot be even thought not to exist. So his point with this is that you can't imagine something not existing, and that is God. So he's using God as this great cannot be thought. So he's saying that you can't imagine God not to exist, because that would be ridiculous, because then he wouldn't actually be as great as he could be. So therefore, since God does exist, because you can't conceive him not to exist, don't forget Psalm 14:1, a fool says in his heart there is no God. So he says that you've got to imagine that there is a God. And that is his premise. And it's to say that you can't think of anything greater. Mainly because if you can think of something greater, then what you were thinking of originally wasn't great in the first place. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you a bit from my hero Hank from Crash Course Philosophy. I'm not going to show you the whole lot at this point, and you may have seen this before, so skip on if you have, but this is a really good way of going through the foundation blocks of the ontological argument. So without any further ado, random YouTube clip time, over to Hank, go.
I'll get to God in a minute, but first I want to go over a few things that the philosophy of religion is not. It's not about believing whatever your parents taught you, because that doesn't prove anything about the truth of a religious belief. If how you were raised proved something about religious truth, then every religion, and therefore also no religion, would be true. So how you were raised can give you a reason that you hold a certain belief, but it says nothing whatsoever about its truth. Philosophy of religion is also not the study of the Bible, because you can't use what's written in a book to prove the truth of the book. You need outside evidence. There's also a whole area of scholarship devoted to understanding the Bible by considering the time and place in which it was written, and such study can be very helpful in understanding certain things about religion. But it doesn't help us here. Philosophy of religion is also not religious anthropology, or religious sociology, or psychological understanding of our reasons for religious belief. Those are all wonderful things that you can and should study, but they are not what we're studying here. What we are doing is considering whether we can offer arguments in support of belief in God's existence. And a long time ago there was a man who argued that God's existence is provable, 11th century French monk Anselm of Canterbury. He offered a deductive argument for the existence of God based on what he understood to be the nature of God's being, or the definition of God. Because the study of being is called ontology, his argument and others like it are called ontological arguments. Now, what do you think God is like? Long, flowing white beard, robe to match, nice guy, hard to reach on the phone. Well, Anselm aimed a little bit higher. In fact, he thought God is, by definition, the best possible thing we can imagine. The best thing. Just try to think of the coolest, awesomest, most amazing and wonderful thing you can imagine, and whatever you're thinking of, Anselm said that God is better. He's just the best. In Anselm's words, God is that than which no greater can be conceived. So what does that mean? Well, it means that God must exist, according to Anselm. After all, he pointed out there are just two ways in which something can exist. Something can exist only in our minds and be strictly imaginary, like Santa or unicorns, or it can exist in our minds but also in reality, like pizza and horses, something that we can imagine, but that's also real. Anselm pointed out, and he does appear to be right about this, that any good thing would be better if it existed in reality as well as in our minds. I mean, unicorns, they're pretty great, but wouldn't they be better if they were real? Or the perfect romantic partner, smart, funny, hot, likes the same movies and games that you do, pretty rich would be pretty nice in your mind, but even better if they actually existed. Well, Anselm thought so too, and from there he believed he could prove God's existence. Because if we define God as the greatest thing that we can conjure up in our minds, the only thing that could possibly be greater than him would be a real version. And since we're already imagining the greatest thing possible, there can't be anything better, therefore God has to exist both in imagination and in reality. Anselm was sure that he had done it, deductively proven God's existence in a way that was immune to error. Here it is one more time, laid out as a philosophical argument. God is the greatest thing we can think of. Things can exist only in our imaginations, or they can also exist in reality. Things that exist in reality are always better than things that exist only in our imaginations. If God existed only in our imaginations, he wouldn't be the greatest thing that we can think of, because God in reality would be better, therefore God must exist in reality. Anselm thought this was a tidy little argument, but when
Okay, so welcome back. What we thought about so far then is we thought about the foundations of what Anselm's ontological argument are and how they start to explain his understanding of God and therefore why he believes that God exists. So there was a response to this by a bloke called Guinilo. Now, Guinilo came up with a theory called the perfect lost island. Had nothing to do with the lost world, but it had the word lost, and the island and the world are fairly similar, and I really quite like the film The Lost World, so I thought it was a good excuse. So he comes up with this idea that there is a perfect lost island. It's so perfect, it exists, but you can never find it. It's like the perfect holiday we spoke of at the start of the lesson, or a perfect bouncy castle, or a perfect cricket ground. It's everything you can imagine. However, you can never find the place. So Guinilo talks about it, saying it's an argument for absurdity, because what actually happens is you've got this brilliant idea, this amazing place, which no one can ever find. So therefore, is that the same of it not existing in the first place anyway, if you've got no evidence or no proof of it occurring? So that's what's going on in here. Guinilo's responding to Anselm and saying, okay, well, I can imagine this thing, you can imagine God, neither of them are provable, both of them are logically true, but clearly it's absurd. So that's the argument of absurdity. So Anselm then goes on to comment about that in his responsio, which is a response to Guinilo. So what I'd like you to do is to, in your notes, just go through now and just identify what is good and what is bad about Guinilo's perfect lost island. Pause this clip now. So the response given then by Anselm to Guinilo's perfect lost island was that God cannot be conceived not to exist because God is a necessary being. I think we've come across that previously in our cosmological argument. You can see how these two tie together. And this is in his Proslogion 3. So this is sort of the point. Okay, an island is contingent. Okay, it requires water around it. It requires the world to be on. You can't quantify what makes it perfect. And a definition of perfect must be provable. Now, when you think about that, God is necessary according to Anselm. God is perfect because you can prove that he's perfect by the definition of God. And therefore, because God is greater than anything you can already think, that just shows that it's provable. That is the argument which is given. Okay, now in the AQA book, it looks something like this. Okay, those of you that have that, it's page 28. Let me just zoom across the other side of the screen. So, this is Anselm's response to Guinilo. He says, to be a perfect, an island would have to be an island than which no greater could be conceived. An island which no greater can be conceived would have to exist necessarily, since a contingent island would be less perfect than an island that existed necessarily. But islands are contingent, and so cannot exist necessarily. Therefore, the logic of the argument related to a perfect lost island does not apply to God. To which he concludes, God is a perfect conceivable being. The greatest conceivable being cannot be conceived to not exist. Therefore, God and God alone poses necessary existence. God cannot not exist. So where we're going to go from here is we need to look at the parable of the gardener by Flew, and we need to look at some other arguments to start reaching a conclusion about, is the ontological argument good at proving the existence of God? So we're going to return to Hank now for our second part of Crush Course. So Hank, over to you.
Of his contemporaries, a fellow French monk named Guanelot, wasn't satisfied. He suggested that we could run the same line of reasoning to prove the existence of literally anything we can imagine. He came up with an argument with the exact same formal structure as Anselm's to prove that a mythical lost island exists. He proposed the best island I can imagine is one where I can swim and relax on a tropical beach and ski down snow-covered mountains all in one afternoon. I can imagine it, so it must exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the best island. There would be one better, and that one would have to be real. Basically, Guanelot said, you could make the same kind of argument to prove the existence of whatever you most wanted, but it wouldn't make it real. Anselm responded to Guanelot's criticism by saying that he'd missed the point, that the argument only works for necessary beings, of which there is only one. God. Folks, what we have right here is a classic example of the fallacy known as begging the question. A fallacy is a flaw in reasoning, something that weakens or destroys an argument, and when you beg the question, you assume the very thing you're trying to prove with your argument. By adding this idea of a necessary being to his definition of God, Anselm makes God's existence a part of the definition of God. A necessary being is one that must exist, so Anselm's response assumed the very point of contention to be true, that God exists. Other philosophers since Anselm have tried to save his argument by tweaking it in various ways, and dissenters have continued trying to deflate them. One of the most famous objections came hundreds of years after Anselm's time from the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant offered the point that, as he put it, existence is not a predicate. A predicate is just something that's said of another object, and Kant thought Anselm's mistake was in thinking that existence is something that can be predicated upon a thing or used as a defining characteristic. For example, if a triangle exists, it necessarily has three sides, but it could be that no triangle exists at all because the idea of existence isn't part of how we define a triangle. Likewise, Kant would say, if God exists, then he must be the greatest being that we can imagine, but that does not mean that he does exist. Predicates add to the essence of their subjects, Kant explained, but they can't be used to prove their existence. British philosopher John Wisdom came up with a thought exercise that sounds a lot like a debate over an ontological argument. It's called The Parable of the Invisible Gardener, which brings us to this week's Flash Philosophy. Let's go to the thought bubble. Person A and Person B return to a garden after a long absence and notice that a few of its plants are still thriving. Person A says a gardener must have been tending the garden while they were gone. Person B doubts this is true, so they agree to wait and see if a gardener shows up. After some time passes, they see no one, so Person A says the gardener must be invisible. So they put up traps and bring in bloodhounds to catch him. When no one is found, Person A says the gardener must be intangible as well as unsmellable. To which B replies, what's the difference between an invisible, intangible, unsmellable, entirely undetectable gardener and no gardener at all? Thanks, Thought Bubble. Can you guess who A and B are really talking about? To give you a sense of how long this back and forth has been going on among philosophers trying to either prove or disprove the existence of God, John Wisdom came up with this parable in 1944, nearly 1,000 years after Anselm and Guanelot.
Okay, we're making some really good timing here today. So far we've talked about if it's good that we can retell the ontological argument, great if we can explain the logic behind it, and even better if we can evaluate it. So what we need to do now is we need to look at a few responses from other people as well. So we're going to look at Kant's response to the ontological argument. Now this is a slightly different response because he aimed this at Descartes' ontological argument rather than Anselm's. However, it still works and still fits really well. Now, Kant said that existence is not a predicate. Existence doesn't have to be to add weight to an argument. So, for example, Kant talks about talers. Now, a taler was a Roman coin. You can see that in the top right of the screen. A taler was a Roman coin, and you could describe a taler and you'd know what it is. However, if I then said that there were 1 million talers in the world, according to Kant, it wouldn't add your value or your understanding about what a taler is, because you know what it is because I've described a coin. In the same way, if I said that a pig gave you bacon and pork and gammon and all the other delightful food that you can, and apologies to any vegetarians and vegans watching this clip, but then said, well, there's 1 million pigs in the world, well, that makes no extra knowledge for you because you know what food comes from a pig. So when you're looking at that, Kant says, how does knowledge of God How does existence add anything to that? Kant just doesn't think that argument works. It's also, Kant would argue, an analytic argument, which is one that's true by definition. So, for example, a bachelor is an unmarried man. A unicorn is a horse with a horn. Well, to say, therefore, that bachelors exist or unicorns exist, is that true? Doesn't matter if it's true or not, because the definition is true. So maybe, God exists. That could just be like bachelors exist or unicorn exists. It could logically be true, but it doesn't therefore mean that there has to be a God. Kant says Anselm's argument would have been better if he had added the word if. If there was a greater than conceivable being in the universe, that God must exist. Had he included the word if, Kant would have been happy with this argument. It's based on the proposition, says Kant, that a God that exists in reality is greater than a God that only exists in the imagination. And he says that argument is based on confusion. So, Kant says that the confusion, it lies on the fact that existence is not a predicate. The predicate is part of the sentence that is not the subject, but which gives some information about the subject. A predicate might be a single word like John laughed, where John is the subject and laughed is the predicate. Or a string of words, as in the sentence Claire went to school, is the subject and went to school is the predicate. A predicate is a property that a thing can possess or can lack. So with that information, Kant in effect throws it completely out the window and says that this argument, like the cosmological argument, just does not work. I'm going to jump up to date now with a slightly more controversial figure, and we're going to think very briefly about Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion. So Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. In that, he tries to tear apart the ontological argument. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch a little clip by a bloke called William Craig, who goes through those arguments. So we're going to pause now while you watch that, and then we'll come back to it.
Finally, the last argument to be discussed is the ontological argument. And the version that I've presented comes from Alvin Plantinga. Now, let's simply summarize the argument. It's possible that a maximally great being, or God, exists. A maximally great being is a being which is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect in every logically possible world. 2, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. That's true by definition because part of maximal greatness is to exist, pardon me, in every logically possible world. 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists. Now, steps 2 through 6 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers will agree that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. So, the real primary issue to be settled is what grounds exist for thinking the premise 1, that it's possible that a maximally great being exists, is true. Now, Dawkins devotes 6 full pages brimming with ridicule and invective to the ontological argument. But he does so without raising any serious objection to Plantinga's ontological argument. He reiterates a parody of the argument, which is designed to show that God does not exist. Because he says a God who created everything while not existing is greater than a God who created everything while existing. And therefore, this proves that God does not exist because a God who could create everything while not existing is greater and therefore would be maximally great. Now, ironically, this parody, far from undermining the argument, actually reinforces it. For think about it. A being which creates everything while not existing, is logically incoherent and therefore impossible. There is no possible world in which a non-existent being exists. Right? That's logically incoherent. So there is no possible world in which a non-existent being exists and creates everything else. So that his parody is based upon a logical incoherence. Such a being isn't possible and therefore doesn't exist in any possible world. So what the atheist has to maintain is that the concept of a maximally great being is similarly logically incoherent. It has to be like the concept of a married bachelor or a round square. But the problem is that it's not like that. There's nothing incoherent about the idea of a being which is omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and exists in every logically possible world. That seems to be a perfectly coherent conception, and therefore that actually supports the truth of premise one, that it's possible that a maximally great being exists. Dawkins also chortles, I've forgotten the details, but I once piqued a gathering of theologians and philosophers by adapting the ontological argument to prove that pigs can fly. They felt the need to resort to modal logic to prove that I was wrong. Now, folks, this is just embarrassing. The ontological argument just is an exercise in modal logic. Modal logic is the logic of the possible and the necessary. This just is a demonstration in modal logic. So I can just imagine Dawkins making a fool of himself at this professional conference with this spurious parody in the same way that he embarrassed himself with his flyweight objection to the teleological argument in the face of correction by eminent philosophers and theologians. Well, I'm over time at this point. I'm sure that you can think of substantive objections or questions to the arguments that I presented. But at least I hope to have shown this morning that the objections raised by Richard Dawkins, and therefore by the new atheists in general, to these traditional arguments for God's existence are not even injurious, much less deadly.
Okay, I hope you found that useful. So Aquinas says that we can never know God's definition as God cannot be defined. But Anselm is trying to define God. Karl Barth then, you can see there 1886 to 1968, said that it isn't a statement about God's existence, it's an argument for a religious truth. While Anselm in his chapter 4 of Proslogion states that words cannot be understood without difficulty in his logic. So you can't say, for example, fire is water, because if you don't get the definitions right, you won't understand the term. So when he says, a fool says in his heart there is no God, that's the definition that God exists. Atheists then clearly don't have a good definition of what it means to believe in God. The problem that Barth says that is with this argument is that Anselm ends with a prayer, and a prayer shows faith. So this is Anselm's prayer. It says, I thank thee, gracious God, I thank thee that when I was formed by thy beautiful bounty, I now so understand thine illumination, that if I was unwilling to believe that thou dost exist, I should not be able to understand this is true. So Barth says this shows a revelation. Nothing greater cannot be conceived. That is an illumination. That's a revelation of the soul. If the argument was that good logic alone would be enough, then the argument would work. But that isn't the argument which Anselm is presenting. God could just be a product of human knowledge and thought and intellect, and there be the main problem with the ontological argument. You see, Anselm's prayer is directed to the fool. Psalm 14, the fool says in his heart there is no God. Now, an atheist would go against the idea of faith. Anselm said he was looking for proof, to prove that God exists, but actually all he ended up doing was reinforcing revelation. Guinillo thinks, though, that it's a proof to say there's a perfect lost island, and that's why he argues logic and not faith. But actually what you've got overall with this is an argument which is based upon faith, that tries to add definition to God. But does it work? Well, that's the question you need to ask yourselves. So we'll leave it there today. I wish you all the best. Stay safe, wash hands, and thanks for your time.